On a quiet suburban street in Liverpool, a blind boy named Sadio gripped a cardboard sign that read, "Help my mum." With trembling hands, his mother, Eleanor, watched from the window of their modest home. Bedridden and overwhelmed by guilt, she saw her 10-year-old son step into a world far too harsh for his age. But Sadio didn't falter. Driven by love and a promise to take care of her, he ventured into the bustling city, determined to make a difference. What happens when a chance encounter with a kind stranger changes everything? Stay with us to uncover this deeply moving story of resilience, hope, and the power of compassion. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emotional Horizons. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The early morning light filtered through the worn curtains of their small home. Inside, the air was heavy with the faint hum of an old ceiling fan and the scent of medicinal ointments. 10-year-old Sadio sat cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully folding a piece of cardboard. His small hands worked methodically, guided by touch rather than sight. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked from the couch where she lay propped up by several pillows. Her voice was weak, laced with worry. Sadio turned his head in her direction, his unseeing eyes full of quiet determination. "I'm sure, Mum. We need the money and I can do this." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she clutched the blanket draped over her frail frame. "I hate this," she whispered, more to herself than to Sadio. "I hate that you have to carry this burden." "I'm not carrying anything, Mum," Sadio replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're a team. Dad always said teams take care of each other." The mention of his father brought a wave of pain crashing over Eleanor. Her husband had been gone for nearly a year, lost to a car accident that left their family shattered. Since then, she had fallen ill, her condition worsening with each passing month. Sadio had taken it upon himself to keep them afloat, despite her protests. She watched as Sadio carefully picked up a black marker and began writing on the cardboard. The letters were uneven, but each stroke was deliberate. "Help my mum." When he finished, he ran his fingers over the words, nodding to himself. "Do you want me to fix it?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "It's fine," Sadio said confidently. "People will understand." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Sadio," she began, her voice breaking, "you're just a child. You shouldn't have to." Sadio stood and walked toward the couch, reaching out until he found her hand. He held it tightly, his grip firm despite the smallness of his fingers. "I'll take care of everything, Mum," he said, his voice steady. "You'll see." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. She wanted to believe him, wanted to share in his unwavering optimism, but the weight of their reality was crushing. She reached out and gently cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek. "You're so much stronger than I ever was," she said softly. "No," Sadio replied, shaking his head. "I learned it from you and Dad. You're the strong ones." The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears and love too deep for words. Finally, Eleanor nodded, though it pained her to do so. "Be careful out there," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me." "I promise," Sadio said, squeezing her hand one last time before stepping away. He picked up the cardboard sign, grabbed his cane from the corner, and headed toward the front door. As he reached for the doorknob, Eleanor called out, "Wait." He turned his head, tilting slightly. "What is it?" I'm proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "More than you'll ever know." Sadio smiled, a flicker of light in the dim room. "I know, Mum," he said. "And I'll make you even prouder." With that, he opened the door and stepped outside. The crisp morning air hit him, and the sounds of the neighborhood greeted him, the distant hum of cars, the chirping of birds, and the soft rustle of leaves. He paused for a moment, taking it all in, then tapped his cane on the concrete path leading away from their house. Inside, Eleanor leaned back against the pillows, clutching the blanket tightly as sobs racked her body. She hated that it had come to this, hated that her little boy had to bear such a heavy burden. But deep down, she also felt an overwhelming pride because, despite everything, Sadio was stepping up in a way most adults couldn't. Outside, Sadio took a deep breath and started walking, the cardboard sign tucked under his arm. He didn't know what the day would bring or how people would react, but he knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to keep his promise to his mother. The city was alive with sound, horns blaring, engines rumbling, voices overlapping as pedestrians hurried along the crowded sidewalks. Sadio stood at the edge of the chaos, gripping his cane tightly in one hand and clutching the cardboard sign with the other. The sheer magnitude of the noise was overwhelming, a sharp contrast to the quiet of his suburban neighborhood. But he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had a mission. Carefully, Sadio tapped his cane against the pavement, his memory guiding him. His father's stories of the city came flooding back, descriptions of bustling streets, towering buildings, and the constant flow of people. Though Sadio had never seen it, he felt as if he could picture it through his father's vivid words. He followed the rhythmic tapping of his cane, stepping cautiously until the din of the street seemed to grow louder. Cars whooshed by, their engines roaring as they passed. The faint scent of exhaust mixed with the tempting aroma of food from nearby vendors. Sadio's stomach growled, but he ignored it, focusing instead on finding the right spot. Finally, he stopped at a busy intersection where the constant stream of footsteps told him this was a prime location. He adjusted the sign under his arm, then turned it outward, holding it firmly in front of him. "Help my mom." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. People passed by, their conversation snippets of a larger, incomprehensible symphony. Some paused, the shuffle of their feet lingering before continuing on. Others dropped coins into his small collection tin with a metallic clink, the sound momentarily lifting his spirits. "Keep going," Sadio whispered to himself. "You're doing this for Mom." The first hour was slow. Most people walked by without acknowledging him, their lives too busy to notice the boy standing quietly on the corner. Sadio tried not to let it bother him. His father had always told him it's not about who doesn't see you. It's about who does. As the morning wore on, a kind voice broke through the cacophony. "Stay strong, little one." Sadio turned toward the sound, startled. A warm hand gently placed a coin in his collection tin. He felt its weight settle alongside the others, and his fingers brushed the edge of the tin in a small, grateful gesture. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but heartfelt. The woman lingered for a moment before walking away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Sadio stood a little taller after that, his resolve renewed. He clutched the sign tighter, holding it high for all to see. As midday approached, the sun warmed his face, a comforting contrast to the noise that still pressed around him. He could hear the faint murmur of someone nearby talking on the phone, a dog barking in the distance, and the rhythmic pounding of construction equipment. It was sensory overload, but Sadio refused to let it deter him. Every so often, another coin would drop into his tin, each one feeling like a small victory. He tried to picture his mother's face when he brought the money home, her relief, her pride. It kept him going, even as his legs grew tired and his arms began to ache from holding the sign. Toward the afternoon, a group of children passed by, their laughter ringing in the air. One of them paused, and Sadio heard the faint rustle of fabric as the child tugged on their parent's sleeve. "Why is he holding that sign, Mummy?" the child asked. Sadio stiffened, his grip tightening on the cardboard. The parent murmured something he couldn't make out, and the sound of hurried footsteps signaled they had moved on. His shoulders sagged slightly. He tried to ignore the pang of humiliation that followed, focusing instead on the sound of coins being dropped into his tin by another passerby. "Thank you," he said automatically, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the city's pace began to shift. The frantic rush of morning gave way to the slower, more deliberate rhythm of evening. Sadio was exhausted, his feet aching and his arms heavy, but he stayed rooted to his spot. He hadn't made much, but every coin mattered. Every small act of kindness brought him one step closer to helping his mom. Just as he was considering packing up for the day, a man's voice cut through the noise. "You've been out here all day, haven't you?" Sadio froze, his grip tightening on the cane. The voice was calm, steady, and unfamiliar. "Who's asking?" he replied, trying to sound confident despite the unease creeping into his chest. "Someone who's been watching," the man replied. "You've got a lot of determination, kid." Sadio tilted his head slightly. "And you've been standing there for how long?" he asked, a hint of defiance in his voice. The man chuckled softly. "Long enough to know you're not giving up." "I respect that." Sadio shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. The man's tone was kind, but Sadio had learned to be cautious. "Well, thanks, I guess," he said hesitantly. "But I don't need anything from you." "Fair enough," the man said, his voice lighter now. "But if you ever want to talk, I'll be around." With that, the man's footsteps faded into the crowd, leaving Sadio standing alone once again. He exhaled slowly, shaking off the strange encounter. He still had work to do, and there was no time to dwell on distractions. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Sadio finally packed up. His collection tin was heavier than when he started. Tired but resolute, he began the long walk home, each step echoing with the promise he had made to his mother, "I'll take care of everything." The morning sun hung low in the sky as Sadio found his usual corner, tapping his cane carefully along the uneven sidewalk. The rhythmic sound of its tip against the concrete grounded him, a small comfort amidst the overwhelming noise of the city. His cardboard sign, now slightly worn from the previous day's efforts, rested under his arm. He adjusted his grip and held it high as he positioned himself near the bustling crosswalk. The city had its rhythm, an endless flow of people moving with purpose, their hurried footsteps and snippets of conversation weaving a tapestry of sound that both intimidated and fascinated him. He had come to recognize patterns in this chaos: the commuters who avoided eye contact, the occasional clink of coins landing in his tin, and the soft murmurs of curiosity from passers-by. Sadio had been standing for hours when he first felt the presence. It wasn't a sound exactly, but a sense that someone was lingering, watching him. He tightened his grip on the sign, his shoulders stiffening. "Hey, kid," a man's voice said, calm and steady. It wasn't rushed or dismissive like the others he'd heard all day. There was something different about it, something warm. Sadio turned slightly toward the voice, his cane tapping instinctively in front of him. "Who's there?" he asked cautiously. "I'm Mel," the man replied. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "What's your name?" "Sadio," he answered after a pause, his tone wary. "Why do you want to know?" Mel crouched down, bringing himself closer to Sadio's level. "Because I've been watching you for a while," he said. "You've been standing here all morning, holding that sign. I wanted to know your story." Sadio hesitated. People rarely stopped to talk to him, let alone ask about his life. Most of them either ignored him or dropped a coin without a word. This man's interest was unusual, and it made Sadio's guard go up. "I'm trying to help my mum," Sadio said simply, clutching the sign tighter. "That's all you need to know." Mel didn't press. Instead, he shifted slightly, leaning on one knee. "That's a big responsibility for someone your age," he said softly. "How old are you, Sadio?" 10, Sadio replied, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. He didn't like being reminded of his age, it made him feel small, like people expected less of him. "But I can handle it." Mel nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you," he said. "You've got a lot of strength for someone so young." Sadio tilted his head, curiosity sparking despite himself. "Why do you care?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Mel smiled faintly, though Sadio couldn't see it. "Because I know what it's like to feel like the world's on your shoulders," he said. "And sometimes it helps to have someone listen." For a moment, Sadio said nothing. The bustling city seemed to fade into the background as he considered the man's words. He couldn't see Mel, but there was something in his voice that made him feel safe, seen. "I don't need help," Sadio said finally, though his voice wavered slightly. "I just need to keep going." Mel's smile widened. "I can see that," he said. "But maybe you can tell me a little more about why you're here. What's your mum like?" Sadio hesitated, his grip tightening on the cane. He rarely talked about his mother to strangers, but something about this man's steady presence made him feel like he could. "She's strong," he said quietly. "Even though she's sick, she doesn't want me to do this. But I don't have a choice. She's all I have." Mel's expression softened, his chest tightening at the boy's words. "That's a lot to carry, Sadio," he said gently. "You shouldn't have to do it alone." "I'm not alone," Sadio replied, his voice firmer now. "I have her. That's all that matters." Mel nodded, his admiration for the boy growing with every word. "You're right," he said. "Family's everything." The two fell silent for a moment, the noise of the city rushing back in like a tide. Mel reached into his pocket, pulling out a bill and folding it carefully. He placed it in Sadio's tin, the faint rustle catching the boy's attention. "Here," Mel said softly. "For you and your mom." Sadio hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Mel stood, brushing off his jeans. "Take care of yourself, Sadio," he said. "And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'll be around." With that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sadio standing on the corner, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know who Mel was or why he had stopped to talk to him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone truly cared. As the day stretched on, Sadio held his sign a little higher, his determination renewed. Somewhere out there, amidst the noise and chaos, someone had seen him. And that made all the difference. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling city streets. Sadio stood at his usual corner, his arms heavy from holding his sign all day. He was tired, more than tired, but he refused to leave. Each coin in his tin was a step closer to easing his mother's pain, and that was all that mattered. He heard the familiar rhythm of footsteps approaching, but this time they stopped in front of him. "Hey, Sadio," the warm, steady voice said. It was the man from earlier, Mel. Sadio straightened, gripping his cane tightly. "You're back," he said cautiously. Mel crouched beside him, his presence calm and reassuring. "I said I'd be around, didn't I?" he replied, a faint smile in his voice. "How's it going today?" Sadio shrugged. "The same. Some people stop. Most don't." Mel nodded thoughtfully. "Mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Sadio hesitated, then nodded. He heard the sound of Mel settling onto the sidewalk beside him, a gesture that felt strangely comforting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the city swirled around them, horns honking, conversations blending into a chaotic hum. Finally, Mel broke the silence. So, he said gently, why don't you tell me more about your mom? Sadio's grip on the sign tightened, the familiar ache of worry settling in his chest. She's sick, he said simply. She can't work, and I have to help her. Mel tilted his head, his voice soft. What kind of sickness? I don't know what it's called, Sadio admitted, his voice wavering. She's always tired, and sometimes she can't even get out of bed. She says it's her heart, but we don't have money for doctors. Mel's heart clenched at the boy's words. And your dad? He asked carefully. Sadio's jaw tightened. He died, he said quietly. Last year. Car accident. I'm sorry, Mel said, his voice heavy with sincerity. Sadio nodded, swallowing hard. It's just been me and Mum since then. She tries to act like everything's okay, but I know it's not. She didn't want me to come out here today. She hates it. His voice broke slightly. But what else can I do? She's all I have. Heard the faint rustle of fabric as Mel settled onto the pavement beside him. It was unusual, adults never sat down next to him. Most either hurried past or tossed a coin his way without a second glance. But Mel was different. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city filled the silence, the honk of distant cars, hurried footsteps, the rhythmic tapping of Sadio's cane against the ground. Tell me something, Sadio, Mel finally said, his tone casual yet thoughtful. If you could have anything in the world for your mom, what would it be? Sadio's fingers brushed over the edge of his cardboard sign, the rough texture grounding him. He thought about it for a moment. A doctor, he said simply. Someone who could make her better. Mel exhaled softly as if considering the weight of Sadio's words. That's a good wish, he murmured. And what about for yourself? Sadio frowned. No one had ever asked him that before. His whole world revolved around his mother, her needs, her health, her comfort. But for himself? He wasn't sure. I guess I'd like to see her smile again, he admitted. A real smile, not the tired one she gives me when she's trying to be strong. Mel was quiet for a moment. You're a good kid, Sadio, he said at last. More people should know your story. Sadio tilted his head slightly. Why? Mel hesitated, then said, because sometimes people need to be reminded of what real strength looks like. Before Sadio could respond, Mel reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill. But this time, instead of simply placing it in the tin, he pressed it gently into Sadio's hand. Take this, he said. And tomorrow meet me back here. I have an idea. Sadio hesitated, feeling the smooth paper between his fingers. What kind of idea? Mel chuckled. The kind that might just change everything. And with that, he stood up, patted Sadio's shoulder lightly, and walked away, leaving the boy with more questions than answers. As the city lights flickered on and the evening rush began, Sadio clutched the bill in his hand. A small spark of something unfamiliar flickering in his chest, hope. Whatever Mel's idea was, he had a feeling it was going to be big. The next morning, Sadio arrived at the same spot, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and curiosity. The city was already alive with its usual rhythm, street vendors shouting their prices, car horns blaring, and hurried footsteps echoing against the pavement. But all Sadio could focus on was the possibility of what Mel had meant the night before. He gripped the bill tightly in his pocket. It was more money than he usually saw at once. His mother had been too exhausted to question where it had come from, simply squeezing his hand with a grateful smile before drifting into another restless sleep. Sadio. The familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head slightly and heard Mel's confident strides as he approached. You came, Mel said, sounding almost relieved. Sadio nodded. You said you had an idea. Mel crouched down to his level again, his voice lower now, more serious. How would you feel about sharing your story with the world? Sadio frowned. What do you mean? I work in media, Mel explained. I tell stories, real stories that matter. And yours? It needs to be heard. People need to understand the struggle you and your mom go through. Not for pity, but so that maybe, just maybe, someone can help. Sadio hesitated. He had spent years blending into the background, being ignored, overlooked. The idea of people suddenly paying attention to him, really seeing him, was both thrilling and terrifying. What if no one cares? He asked quietly. Mel smiled, but there was something determined in his eyes. Trust me, kid. They will. With that, Mel reached into his bag and pulled out a small recording device. He held it up between them. I just want you to talk, he said. Tell me about your mom. About your life. Whatever you're comfortable with. Sadio swallowed hard, glancing around at the people passing by. Most weren't paying attention, too absorbed in their own lives. He took a deep breath. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. Mel pressed the button and the red light blinked to life. Okay, Sadio, he said gently. Start from the beginning. Sadio licked his lips and exhaled slowly. My name is Sadio, he began. And this is my story.